My name is Carrie Wilson. My grandparents were George and Josie Hicks. They were born in Floyd County, Kentucky. So my grandma actually went by Marie. Everyone knew her as Marie. She married my grandfather, George, when she was in her early 20s. They had some children pretty early. As poor as they were and as hard as times were, my grandmother was an incredible mother to her children. My mom talks about the way that no matter how little money they had, they always had food because she planned ahead, because she was always canning food, because we believe God blessed her. She was always so giving and gave food to neighbors or to people at church. No matter what she had, she would give it. My mother was exactly the same way when I grew up. They both had a very kind-hearted, giving nature, selfless mothers. They moved quite a bit from Kentucky to Ohio to Florida to Ohio, back to Florida, back to Ohio eventually because he was constantly switching jobs. He didn't get along with people very well. As a result, he switched jobs constantly. According to my mom, really, he was paranoid, and he would come home saying that coworkers or a boss were attacking him or out to get him. And it was much the same at home. So he was like that with my grandmother, blamed her for everything. He said the best thing to do for a woman is to keep them barefoot and pregnant at home. So my grandmother couldn't drive. She never got her license. He really believed her place was at home. So he alienated her from her parents and from her siblings. He really made it hard. So my mom grew up not really knowing her mom's side of the family and not a lot of her dad's side either. There were good times too. I think there were good things about his character. I don't think people are actually that simple. A lot of what he was the disease he had, a lot of his mental illness. My mom has good memories of him too. He was very hardworking. At times he could be very stable for months and he would hold a job and the family had plenty of money, and times could be good. They were a close family, so all of the siblings were very close. They played out on the farm, they worked together. In a lot of ways, my grandfather was a tyrant also in the house, and that kind of unified all of the kids. Together they had 9 kids. The youngest, actually died when he was, I think, around 2 years old, developmentally disabled, and it was really, really hard for them. It was challenging. My mom at that time was maybe 8 or 9 years old, and she just remembers the funeral and everybody playing. Sheila had a hard life, pretty young. She was the oldest sister. She ended up taking care of a lot of the younger siblings. So my grandfather worked a lot on farms and factories. He switched jobs a lot. And then his wife, my grandma, stayed home, and with 9 children, you can imagine she stayed very busy. As a very low-income family, they lived off canning vegetables, and she did all their laundry and all the housekeeping and stayed very busy. So when my grandfather was in and out of jobs, in between, if he wasn't working with a factory, he was working at a junkyard or farming. So one weekend, he went to a farmer's market and took Sheila with him to help, and they took a truck and had a mattress and a cab over it. They couldn't afford a hotel. And that evening, he actually raped my aunt. After that weekend, Sheila went home and went back to school, and she told a teacher about what her father had done. My grandfather was arrested and went into a mental health institution for a few years. And he was eventually released at the time that my mom's youngest brother, Michael, passed away. So he came back for the funeral and went back in and was released shortly after. When things were bad, it was usually because he would go off of his medicine. At times he felt well enough, right, and he thought he didn't need it and would go off of it, and the family would know when those things were happening. It was sort of a build-up, and he would start accusing Marie, his wife, my grandmother, of cheating on him, or having the neighbors over while he was gone, or letting his daughters play in the park with, there was a men's soccer team, and he said that they had slept with everybody on the team while they were at the park. These are just examples. He was manic. He was paranoid schizophrenic. They met and married actually when my grandmother was 20. It was a really small town. There wasn't much to do. Marie's father did not like George, but Marie was really caught up in the thrill of it. She was 20. They lived in a very small town. She didn't drive. George did. He worked. He had money. It was exciting. My parents are Carl and Lily. My mom was 15 when she met my dad at a square dance. They danced and won a cake dance together and split the cake. My mom's siblings, my aunt and uncle, actually remember her bringing half the cake home. They dated for a little while. My dad came around a lot and helped out on the farm, so my mom's dad really liked my dad for a while. He loved that he would help in the garden, carry things for them, help on the farm, feed the animals. He really liked him at hay baling time. After a while, though, their relationship soured a little, mainly because my dad started to put up some boundaries. My grandfather would take advantage as far as people would let him push. So he would want my dad to work essentially a full-time farm job without any pay. He would actually make jokes about the payment was his daughter. So eventually, really, they stopped getting along. My dad was always very close with my grandmother, though. My mom's mom was like his own mother, really. He came over to the house. He wrestled with the younger brother, George, all the time. They remember this still to this day and laughed about it. My dad was 18 and my mom was 15 when they met. So they got close really fast and spent a lot of time together. And I think my mom really just started to feel like she didn't have a lot of experience. She was young. My dad was in the working world and she was still in high school. She was thinking about college and playing basketball and had other priorities. So they broke up for a little while. Shortly after, she dated a man named Rick, but really discovered that she loved my dad and she wasn't happy where she was and broke things off then at that point. Shortly after my mom and dad actually reconnected, my mom found out that she was pregnant and it was Rick's. My dad had a lot to get through. Obviously, he was pretty young for something that big, but they loved each other and he wanted to be with her. So eventually they got married pretty young, and my dad adopted my sister. My mom was still in high school when she had Crystal, so she still went to class and worked. And while she did that, my grandmother, Marie, watched the baby. One day while my mom was at school, my grandfather came into the house where he and Marie were watching the baby. And he was resentful over something at the time, and I think it had to do with them no longer receiving assistance with the baby. So George took the baby, actually kidnapped the baby and took her over to the biological grandmother's house and dropped her off. Marie came back and the baby was gone, and they discovered that he had done this, and Rick's mom, the baby's biological grandmother, actually called to have them come pick up the baby and said that George dropped it off and he wasn't making sense, and she really felt like he needed some help. When my mom was 18, she married my dad. At that time, my grandparents actually moved with the three younger siblings, which were Bonnie, Janice, and George. They moved back down to Florida. There, they lived in a junkyard. Janice and Bonnie actually tell stories about rigging a bucket. They caught rainwater in a bucket and took showers. They didn't have running water. Over a few months, they started noticing that their dad, my grandfather, was doing really strange things. He started accusing his wife again of things that just weren't true, about cheating on him, or he would accuse the girls of sneaking out and staying out all night when they didn't. They were just coming home from school. Sometimes they had very little food and the kids would get in the cupboard and just eat an entire loaf of bread when they got home from school, and then duck and dodge and hope their dad wouldn't get mad. So when Marie and the kids started to realize that their dad really was unwell, he was getting more and more physically and emotionally abusive, they started mailing things to their siblings, my mom in Ohio. Things like a quilt would show up, or keepsakes. They were actually planning an escape. They were going to leave while he was out working one day. They just didn't know yet how. They didn't have a ride, they didn't have money. But there were things they knew for sure they wanted to take from Florida to Ohio, so they would ship them, and strange things were showing up in the mail at my mom's house. And she eventually found out that's because they were planning to move. Eventually, my Uncle Reuben actually came down to visit them, and he brought furniture and other things for them to sell or to fill their temporary home with. When he got there, though, Marie and the kids unloaded everything and started loading their things to move. It was a flatbed truck, and that's all they had room for with the kids, so they nailed a chain to the flatbed so that the dog couldn't jump off, and the dog and the kids rode on the back of the flatbed from Florida to Ohio. When George, my grandfather, realized that they were packing up to leave, he tried to stop them, and he actually called the police to make them stop. The police did not make them stop. They loaded up peacefully. They had a police escort all the way to the Florida line. George also followed along behind the police and turned around at the Florida line. Marie and the children, the three younger children, moved back to a farmhouse in Ohio. It was about a month, I believe. George returned to Ohio and wanted to move back into the farmhouse with my grandmother and the kids, and she wouldn't let him. He threatened them, I think, and left. My grandfather called his nephew Buford to drive him around, and Buford called my grandmother and said, "You've got to get out of the house. George just bought a gun, and he asked me to drop him off, and he's coming to kill you." So my grandmother took the three youngest kids, and they stayed at the sheriff's department all night long. So George went to the farmhouse while they were gone and went out to the garage and got some gas, dumped it all on the inside of the house, and lit the fire. He burned the house down completely to the ground. I think it burned for several days. After burning down their farmhouse, he walked 5 to 7 miles down the road to my uncle's house, and then he burned that as well with the dog inside. He returned to the farmhouse and he hid in the outhouse, and his plan was to wait for my grandmother to come back, and he was going to shoot her. Instead, a neighbor stopped by just to check on the burning house. His name was Jonathan Weller. My grandfather walked up to him and said, "I'm going to need to borrow your car." And he shot him right in the chest, stumbled a few steps and fell backwards, and he died. There was a 3-day manhunt after that. It was baffling to everyone that they hunted for him for 3 days and couldn't find him, and supposedly he was hiding in outhouses and fields, and no one knows or understands how he physically could have evaded the police and walked that long. He didn't actually walk that well. He was in his 60s and had arthritis. He walked with a limp, and people kind of knew that, and it's actually, my mom talks about it now, and that it's really surprising that he walked that far in that short amount of time. 3 days later, he walked up to a farmer in the field and said, "I think I've done something wrong," and handed him the gun. So the farmer called the police and let him know he was there. They sat and talked until the police got there. George was arrested and charged with murder. The trial lasted several months. He actually said in court that it didn't matter. He would plead insanity, and they'd put him away for a little bit, and he'd get out early on good behavior, and he would come back and murder his entire family. But he was found not guilty on account of insanity. He did go to a mental health institution for about 1.5 years, and then he was released after pretty intense treatment. I didn't know a lot about my grandfather when I was little. I asked my mom a lot of questions. I grew up actually only knowing my grandmother, and I would ask her, "Where is your dad now? What does he do? Why don't you talk to him?" I couldn't imagine any kid not actually talking to their father. She would tell me stories in bits and pieces, but it wasn't real pleasant for her to relive those things either. So I think I really had to push to get answers. After my grandfather was released from the mental health institution, he moved to Arkansas, and the kids really didn't hear from him very much at all. I think 1 or 2 letters over the next couple decades. I didn't meet my grandfather until I was 16. He was on his deathbed, and I went to meet him. I squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. We locked eyes, but he couldn't talk. And then he died the next day. I didn't really feel anything. It's just a guy. Yeah, and my mom wasn't excited to go. It's her father's funeral. Still want some closure.